who underwrites this whole series, and also thanks to the Santa Fe Reporter and the Lensic for their support. Thank you. So I've been given the great honor of introducing Radhika Nagpal, who's long been one of my own intellectual heroes in the field of complex systems. Radhika is currently the Augustine Professor in Engineering at Princeton, and she's really had a long career of doing cutting-edge research on biologically inspired computing and swarm robotics, which you'll hear more about from her, and collective intelligence in general in biological and in AI systems. And she's also, in addition to her academic career, she's an entrepreneur. She co-founded a company called Root Robotics, which does educational robotics. And Radhika's received many awards for her research, way too many to list here, but I'll mention two. In 2014, she was named by the journal Nature as one of the top 10 influential scientists and engineers of that year. And in 2021, she was named by Newsweek magazine as one of America's 50 greatest disruptors. And I'll take that disruptors is a large compliment in the tech world. Okay, so tonight she'll tell us about her very disruptive research on collective behavior in robotics. Let's welcome Radhika Nagpal.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me here. I don't know about the disruptive part, but today I wanted to tell you some stories of science and maybe even just AI as a kind of investigation of science. And I'm calling it Taming the Swarm. So I'm a computer scientist and also a roboticist. And the area and theme that I study is collective intelligence, as Melanie mentioned, which is how we can have large numbers of individuals with maybe simple and local interacting rules that cooperate to achieve globally complex behavior. So what does it mean for a computer scientist and a roboticist to study collective intelligence? Well, some days, great days, it looks something like this. So this is me on my 45th birthday, trekking 10 miles a day, 90-degree weather, 100% humidity in Panama at the Smithsonian Tropical Institute to study army ants. And this is actually going to be the subject of my talk today, so I hope you like ants. But army ants are this spectacular example of collective intelligence. Millions of them work together without any leaders in charge, and they build their entire nest out of their bodies. They even create these crazy bridge-like structures to get over terrain that they don't like. And they're constantly working together to change their environment to work for them. But lots of other things can also be considered collective intelligence. I like to think of cells as having collective intelligence. Cells with identical DNA cooperate to create complex structures from fruit fly to starfish to ourselves. You can also think of collective intelligence as operating at really large scale. So these are examples of termite mounds that can be anywhere from 2 to 10 meters high. And in fact, they're created by insects that are centimeter scale in their size. So it's little individuals creating this tremendous skyscrapers full of internal structure. And of course, who can forget bird flocks and fish schools and herds of bison? We see groups navigate in nature, moving together, moving around obstacles, sometimes even creating these beautiful displays out of themselves. So I just showed you examples of these collective systems, and I think that these systems are fascinating to pretty much all of us when we observe them. And I think one of the things that makes it fascinating intuitively is that each individual is just so tiny compared to the massive phenomenon that they are creating. And so it kind of boggles the mind how the group can function when each individual must be only able to see limited things in its environment and yet not know what's going on at the other edge of the swarm. But somehow the system is coordinating so well, and it's coordinating so well that we often just even forget that there are individuals. We just think of this as one entity. It's a school, it's a swarm, it moved left, it moved right. It's a it, because we don't even think of the individuals as existing separately. So that to me is always just amazing and striking. It's kind of an intelligence that is emerging at the collective level. But we also actually do know some things about the algorithms or the mechanisms by which this collective intelligence comes together. And in these examples, it actually really is remarkable that we know that there are actually no leaders supervising these groups. Instead, somehow this incredible collective intelligence is emerging from individuals interacting with other individuals using relatively simple rules, but then somehow those simple rules, when run by this very, very large decentralized group, are creating something that from the outside looks like collective behavior. And it's a kind of self-organization that, of course, feels both mysterious, but also is just incredibly powerful. So, of course, these systems exist in nature, and we can study them as biologists, but we can also ask about making them. So what would it mean to create our own artificial collectives based on these same principles? So in AI, we often think of natural intelligence as a model for systems that we might be able to create. And maybe we create these systems to solve applications, but sometimes we also build systems just to probe the nature of intelligence. Do we understand the principles by which intelligence arises? And a lot of AI focuses, maybe not surprisingly, on human intelligence, copying and understanding what humans do. But we could also think of copying what ant colonies do. So for example, what would it mean if we could create a colony of robots that did all of the things that ant colonies do? So for example, explore their territory, forage and collect food, maybe even just build their nest or their structure. So in the early 1990s, a young researcher pondered this question. Maya Matarik grew up in the former Yugoslavia. She did her undergrad at the University of Kansas and then came to MIT for her PhD in robotics. And she became, from the work that she did during her PhD, and then later as a professor, she became one of the pioneers of the field that is now known as swarm robotics. So she asked the question, can we build robots that cooperate the way ant colonies do? And in order to, that cooperate the way ant colonies do without any leaders, so purely through interactions between individuals. And so not only did she create algorithms and programming models to make this happen, she actually also created one of the first robot swarms that operated on these principles. So here you can see a picture of that swarm. That was in 1993. There were 20 robots that would work together to explore their arena. They would find food, which was like these orange pucks, and stack them. And they could even work together to push obstacles out of the way, like if you put a box in front of their nest or something like that. And in this process, she showed that we could actually create cooperation with robots that were actually quite simple in their individual capabilities, but as a group could do really remarkable things. Many people were inspired by Maya Matarik's work. So was I. I was a much younger researcher at MIT many years later, and I was super inspired both by this work and also by Maya herself. So just a little bit about me. I grew up in a small town called Amritsar in India, and I have to admit that I hated ants. In fact, I'm pretty sure I hated all insects at that point. I also didn't know a whole lot about science and engineering, and I didn't really have any female role models. So it was actually only after I began college that I learned all of these things. In fact, my goal in joining college was very simple. It was to get a job that would give me the financial freedom so that I could make my own decisions. But while I was in college, I started to discover that I liked to build things and I liked to program. And I started to get excited about this area. So really, it was actually quite late in my life, though, that maybe in my mid-30s, that I essentially rediscovered robotics and started to become enamored with ants. And so in my group, we've actually built a lot of different robot swarms that are inspired by different kinds of animals. So we've done things inspired by fish, we've done things inspired by bees, we've done things inspired by termites that build. But today I'm really going to talk about something inspired by ants, similar to what Maya was thinking about at that time. How can ants inspire us to make robot colonies? And so I'm going to tell you a story about a project in my group where we were inspired by the spectacular collective intelligence of army ants. And this will be the story of 5 people, 3 roboticists and 2 biologists, who went to Panama in March 2016 to observe and experiment with this, to observe this amazing system in its natural habitat. All right, so I just want to start with a little video. So you saw a little bit of this before already, but army ants are truly the queens of self-assembly and reconfiguration. And together with other ant species like fire ants and weaver ants, they self-assemble structures out of their own body on demand. So they're constantly forming and unforming structures to solve problems in their environment. Because they're nomadic, they actually self-assemble their whole nest out of their body, so they migrate every fortnight, and then when they migrate to a new place, they just recreate their nest. And they also create these crazy bridge structures to get over rough terrain that they don't like. And even though the bridges might get damaged or destroyed by humans, aka me, they can actually repair it just within a minute or 2. In fact, we accidentally stepped on one of the nests and we actually saw a nest self-repair itself. So it's pretty crazy. So we still don't fully understand how these systems work, but we can create artificial setups to try to reverse engineer or try to understand what is happening with these systems. And so we're beginning to learn some of the principles. For me, I'm also just really amazed at looking at these systems close up. I hope this doesn't totally creep you out. But these are ants crawling all over other ants that are like linked to each other. It's just an amazing system, this living, breathing kind of tissue. It almost looks like a cell tissue in the way that they function. And so somehow they are both organisms, but then also materials and collectives in this strange way. And for me, I found that just incredibly fascinating. Okay, so why do army ants make bridges? Well, it turns out they make bridges for reasons that we can all, I think, relate to. So maybe you've been to a park where there's a sort of sidewalk you're supposed to walk on, and it goes kind of roundabout way. But later on, you start noticing people just cut across. And then people have cut across so much that like the grass has started to be removed. So now there's a cut-through path. So somebody's made like a shortcut in the system. We make a lot of shortcuts in life. Well, the army ants do this too, but it's a little bit weirder. So this is a picture that you saw earlier where I broke the bridge. And what you see here, I can't know if you can see it, they can actually go this long path, so they can go the long way around, but they don't want to, which is why they actually create this shortcut bridge across. And so my colleague, Simone Garnier, and his team had worked on this before. They noticed that a lot of times these bridges were in situations where there was like a V or a detour, and the bridges were actually a shortcut. So using this idea, they studied some natural bridges, but then they also created an artificial detour. So this thing that you see on the left is a white detour, and they're tricking the army ants to go on this detour, and then they can change the angle of the detour, so they can make it a really sort of flat one, or a really sort of one where you kind of want to cross already. And with this, they started to study what were the conditions under which army ants make bridges. And they made some really interesting discoveries. One of the first discoveries was that it really depended on traffic. So if there weren't a lot of ants on this path, then no bridges would form. The ants would just happily take the long way around. But if the traffic got heavy and there was congestion, then all of a sudden these bridges would start forming. And even weirder is that the width of the bridge was proportional to the traffic. So the more traffic you had, the bigger bridge you got. And then if you stop the traffic, or the traffic died out, or in some cases they just diverted it, then this bridge would kind of get up and leave. It would just disassemble. And so what you would see is the ants on the edge of the bridge would kind of leave first, then the next ones, then the next ones, kind of like when you put a sugar cube in water and it dissolves. You basically see the bridge dissolve. So I'll actually show you some videos where you can see this too. So it's really, really cool. So this is actually kind of a crazy observation, right? That you have this amazing adaptive self-assembly. So for me, I thought like, wow, this is the best sustainable architecture ever, you could get, right? When you need it, stuff grows to meet your need. When you don't need it, it shrinks and goes away. And you always have like exactly the right size. I mean, I wish the George Washington Bridge worked this way, right? It's like when on peak traffic, suddenly it gets really wide and like there's no congestion. And then when there's nobody on it, it just shrinks and you can just see the river beautifully without anything in your way. But this is essentially what the army ants are doing. So they're making these bridges that are not only shortcuts, but really, really adaptive shortcuts, and they're temporary. So now we know what they do globally, but of course it's much harder to reverse engineer what is an ant thinking. So what makes an ant decide to be part of the bridge or decide to even start a bridge? And so we don't at all know the answer to that. But there was a really interesting hypothesis about how this might occur. And the hypothesis is that it could be from a very, very simple ant behavior. So imagine for a moment that you're an ant, and what you do is normally you're just walking along the path and you happily walk along. But then you start to experience congestion. And so in this case, congestion is that other people are actually climbing over you. So you're getting stepped on, and this is your form of congestion. And so if you're getting stepped on, you decide, okay, I'm not going to walk anymore. I'm just going to be stationary, and I'm going to become part of the bridge, and I'm going to let people walk over me, which of course none of us would really want to do, but the ants are very strong and actually like physically very different from us. So you stop and you become a bridge and you let people walk over you, or you let other ants walk over you. And then similarly, maybe you've been sitting around for a while and nobody has walked on you for a while, and then you decide, okay, well, I don't need to be a bridge anymore and I can leave. So that's the bottom. So we think of this as a two-state machine. You're in a walking state or a bridge state, and there's a transition. So if I'm in walking state, I turn into a bridge if someone walks on me. I'm in bridge state, I go back to walking if nobody is walking on me. So it's really simple. So why would this arise? Why would this create the right behavior? And there's a little bit of like a trick in this piece, a piece that we don't fully understand. So the idea is that if there's no traffic, or very little, then everybody's walking. But if there's suddenly congestion, then a lot of individuals are getting walked on. So suddenly they become part of the bridge. But by becoming part of the bridge, they actually create new territory to walk over, which actually relieves congestion. So now no more ants are experiencing congestion, and that's why the bridge stops growing. So hopefully that makes sense. It's like there's congestion, you make a bridge, but then the bridge fixes the congestion, and then everything just stabilizes. So we call these kind of algorithms self-stabilizing. They start, and then something within them causes them to decide when enough is enough. And then, of course, if the traffic goes away, then the second part of the state machine can work, which is that the individuals in the bridge now are no longer experiencing congestion, so they can start getting up and going away. And in this way, the bridge can constantly be just the right size to make the congestion zero. This is the hypothesis. So it's still really hard to prove that, but it is a really attractive way to think about how a very simple ant behavior could result in something that is globally so smart. So this was sort of the observation from Simone's group. The second observation that I want to make actually is something that biologists typically take for granted, but for engineers like myself is a little bit harder to think about. And that is that the bridge doesn't look like human bridges. Human bridges, we make them out of trusses and lattices and very regular. And the reason we do that is because that provides material strength. Trusses are really strong, so when you have things made out of triangles, that's a really strong way of building things. And it means that your bridge can last for really long, and you haven't wasted a lot of material. They're also really easy to analyze. But these bridges look nothing like that. These are more organic looking. We call them amorphous, but I think most of us would call them organic. There's just a lot of ants, and they're just attached all over the place to each other. So it looks super messy, and clearly is using many more ants than you need. But the interesting thing in this method is that you can make bridges really fast, because nobody has to attach to anyone very precisely. So the ants are just coming and grabbing onto each other in all different ways, and there's no precision. So it's this really fast construction, but messy construction. And then the other thing is that it's also kind of compliant. So the ants and their legs, they're not rigid like a truss. A truss is to be like a perfect size. But here, this thing can kind of deal with some vibrations and the messiness of the environment. So it's both soft and also messy. So it turns out that, of course, most bridges that we think of are not like that, or most construction, we don't do it this way. But there is actually one case where, as people, we do construct in the same way. And it's when people build out of sandbags. So if you have to build a levee in a flood situation, you need a lot of people to build really fast. And we don't have time to train everybody to make you an expert builder. So we need a material that's easy to use, that's compliant. So sandbags, you can kind of put them on each other, and they'll just kind of like mush together. And so they're soft and they're compliant, and now you can have lots of people build really fast, and the point of the structure is to be temporary. So interestingly enough, we also have an example when we want to build really fast temporary structures. We actually use a method that is closer to army ants than when we want to build structures that live for a long time. So maybe that's one reason the structures look this way, is that these are structures that they're forming and unforming constantly in their environment. It's not a long-term commitment. It's a short-term need that's being solved through self-assembly. So army ants are cool. I hope I've convinced you of that. Wouldn't robots be cooler? So imagine that we could create a robot colony inspired by army ants. So it would do all of the things that the nerd herd did. So it could explore the environment. Maybe it could collect materials in the environment and bring it to one place, so it could forage and explore. But then if it experienced a difficult terrain, then maybe it can self-assemble a bridge or a ramp or a chain or a tower to get through whatever problem it experienced in its environment. Maybe it could self-assemble a shelter to prevent some things from being rained on, or protect things from the elements. And this kind of self-assembly would be then all of a sudden like the army ants. So in my group, we were really inspired by this. Of course, self-assembling robots that could do this are still in the realm of science fiction. So please do not expect that we're actually going to, I'm not going to show you robots that can do all of these things. But for us, experimenting with these ideas is also a way of understanding natural intelligence. So the two observations I gave you are the two observations that this project was based on. And I should say that this project was led by Melinda Malley, who did her PhD in my group and is now visiting faculty at Olin. And Melinda's vision was that we would create a new robotic system, and it would be called Eceton Robotica, so adding a species into the Eceton genus. And the two things we would look at were, can we design soft robots that can climb over each other and form these organic structures? And what do we get if we have soft robots? What does that give us over rigid robots that make trusses? Can we get some of the same interesting properties? And the second one was, can we design rules for self-assembly similar to the army ant? So if we take the army ant rule and we simulate it for these robots, or we simulate it for ants, would we actually recover the hypothesis that the biologists had put before us? Does it really result in the kind of self-stabilizing behavior? So basically making robots and experimenting with rules. And so that's what Melinda Malley did. So I'm going to start by showing you her robots. And the first caveat is the robots don't look like ants. So when we experiment with biological hypotheses, we don't always copy everything. Ants are actually really, really complicated. And there are groups that are trying to copy ants that are six-legged and have antennas and have all these sensors. I am not capable of that. So in our group, we actually made a different kind of robot that's maybe more inspired by slugs and caterpillars, and maybe even just like by nothing biological at all. but it still has the same properties of soft and organic self-assembly. So I'm going to show you a video sort of illustrating this robot first. All right, so here you can see Melinda, and you can see her robot in its natural habitat, which is also very green. And the robot has 2 legs and a soft body, and it has 2 cables. So when you pull one cable and you release the other cable, the robot is able to flip its body over and bend it. So you can think of this as a puppet, where you're like pulling the strings and moving the body with these strings. And so the way this robot moves is it flips itself over, and then when its foot hits something, it grabs, and then it flips its body over. And you can think of the foot as essentially searching for something to grab onto. And in this way, it can actually climb and move in many different orientations. I don't know if this will be as impressive to you, but it's actually really hard to make climbing robots that transition from one orientation to another. So we were super excited that we could make this robot do these things. And it's really important that the body be soft, because as you go through these different transitions, the body is actually really compliant. It gets compressed or stretches a little, and so it takes away some of the uncertainty in the system. And we have sensors in the feet so they can detect when they're touching something. But the other piece is gripping. So how does the robot grip onto something strongly enough that it can flip its whole body over and then grip again? So here, Melinda was inspired by the fact that ants have microspines and tarsal hooks that allow them to grab into textured surfaces. And so we created grippers that can grip into textured surfaces. So they have these little corkscrews, which you'll see in a second. And we turn the corkscrews, and they can grab into things like foam or carpet or Velcro by sort of spiraling in and grabbing onto things. And then when we want to let go, we spiral the other way and kind of come out of the system. And you can actually make really strong connections with this, surprisingly. But then we covered the robots in texture itself. So now not only can the robot climb over the environment, it can also climb over other robots. So here you can see it climbing over another stationary robot. All right? And hopefully, it'll be able to climb over multiple robots. So here you can see, you can also see that it's not exactly reliable. We've got a little caught there. But we can actually make pretty interesting structures like cantilevers and chains with this. Okay, so we can grab, we can climb, but the next piece of the puzzle was that ants could detect when somebody was walking over them. So how do our robots detect if they're being walked over? So we decided to use vibration. So the robots actually create vibrations. And so when they step on someone else, you feel it because you feel their vibrations. And insects use this idea of stridulation, which is communicating through vibration. So we use that idea. So here you see 2 robots. And the top robot ends up climbing over the bottom robot. And when the bottom robot feels that it's being walked on, because it detects us through the vibration, it decides to go into bridge state and just stay there and let the other robot climb over it. So you can see that here. And then it leaves bridge state, but then it tries to escape our experiment. So these robots are still pretty limited. For example, even though we're moving against gravity, they're still only in 2D. But if you had 3 strings and with a lot more work, we could potentially make them move in different ways. So we're still considering different ways of thinking about these soft robots. But we made 2 of them, and we were able to illustrate the basic idea, which is still pretty far from the vision. Okay, so we have 2 robots. So how do we experiment with rules? Well, to experiment with rules, we might need hundreds of robots. And that's where simulation comes in. And so we created a simulation, or essentially an animation. Well, a simulation is a better word for it. And I'll just explain the simulation a little bit here. So at the top are these small little robots. We're just modeling them as 2 feet, and they'll move with flipping. And we created an environment that was very similar to what Simone and his colleagues had looked at, which is that there's a V detour. So the robots can just flip and walk down this V detour. But if they collide with each other or get stepped on, then they turn into bridge state. And when they turn into bridge state, they turn into that lighter color. So you can sort of see that they've changed state by this light color. And I think that was Those were the things I wanted to tell you about the simulation. And then we simulated with different conditions. So what happens in low traffic, what happens in high traffic, what happens if we stop the traffic. And so I'll show you a video of this. But a good way to think of this is as a video game. This is a video game, kind of like the lemmings. You will see lemmings moving along this track. All right, so here are little lemmings, and they're flipping around and moving. And this is sort of low traffic. So we did have a collision, and a little bridge formed. But once the bridge formed, there's actually no more collisions. So the traffic has stabilized, any congestion is gone with this little bridge. Now we create some more traffic. You can see that the robots are really close to each other, so now they're like bumping into each other along the way. So we start to form this bridge. As the bridge forms, it does smooth out the traffic, but you can see the bridge is still forming here. And every time there's a collision, and now all of a sudden we have a pretty decent bridge. Okay, and somebody is trapped. Okay, so now we stop the traffic, and it's really fun to see. So we've stopped the traffic. So now individuals in the bridge are free to leave. Of course, you're not exactly free to leave if you're stuck at the bottom. So individuals suddenly decide that they're leaving, and they climb over others, who then can't leave because they keep getting climbed over. So eventually that poor one at the top will get a chance to leave, but for now it's just stuck there. No leave. And we did have some cases of deadlock, which we never observed with the ants, but I think those two robots stay there forever. All right, so it turns out that this algorithm works for lots of different things. You can make ramps, you can make sort of staircases. So it's not actually specific to making a bridge across a V. It can make a bridge across complex terrains. And in some recent work, Melinda and some of her new students showed that you could even close gaps with it. So in this case, it's an algorithm that's similar. Every time you get stepped on, you turn into a bridge, but this allows you to make a cantilever to actually reach the other part. And weaver ants actually do this quite a bit. They're able to make cantilevers like this across different branches. So we were able to replicate a lot of the results that the biologists believed were true from this rule, and we did it with something that doesn't even look like ants. It's actually robots. So it just gives you this sense of like maybe these ideas might be really general. So in low traffic, you get no bridge. In medium traffic, you get kind of small bridges. In high traffic, you get big bridges. And then if the traffic is really, really high, you get essentially a pileup. And of course, we know what a pileup looks like, but actually they observed pileups with the ants as well. So it turned out this was something that had been observed. Okay, so one of the other things we can do with this kind of simulation is we can create something that we call a phase space. Maybe some of you already have heard of phase space, but in case you haven't, the idea is that I'm going to create a grid, and on the left of the grid, or on the vertical axis, is the traffic flow. So at the top, the flow is really low, and at the bottom, the flow is really high. So we're thinking of flow on this side. And then on the horizontal axis, we're thinking about the terrain. So there, at the left is like a really narrow terrain that's like really annoying. Everyone's going to collide into everyone. And on the right is a terrain that's so wide it might as well have been flat. So we have these two axes. And then we do a bunch of simulations to fill in all of the boxes in this two-dimensional space. And we think of this as sort of the phase space. Like, what are the different parameters and what are the behaviors that we'll see? So if you think about this bottom left corner, this is actually the worst case scenario, super congested. There's really, really high traffic and there's a really narrow gap. So it's the most congested region. And then the upper right is like the easiest problem. So there's very little traffic and the terrain is practically flat. So we can show in this system a really nice phase space. So at the bottom left here, there's stable bridge formation, and the bridge is proportional to the difficulty of the problem. So if it's really high traffic or really, really small gap, then we get a bigger bridge. And in the upper right corner, no bridges are forming at all. So it never makes a mistake and forms a bridge in the upper side. And then between those two regions, there's kind of this weird stochastic region where sometimes you get a bridge and sometimes you don't. And it kind of depends on random fluctuations whether or not you get a bridge. But they're pretty small bridges no matter what. Okay, so these phase spaces are actually really common throughout science. And it allowed us to think about something that maybe hadn't occurred to us before. And that is a very similar phase space is seen for things that are not living. And we call this idea jamming. So ants are actually behaving like materials. So jamming is something that all of us are actually super familiar with. So for anyone here, actually I'm assuming everybody has done this, but you have a bag of rice and you have a funnel. And you pour the rice through the funnel, right? Now technically the rice are really small and the funnel opening is open, but nevertheless jams form. You're pouring and the thing gets jammed, it just gets stuck. And what happens is the rice form this little like bridge-like structure, and all of a sudden this whole system can get stuck together, and we call this a jam. But we also know that if you pour the rice really slowly, it doesn't jam. If you try to pour the rice really fast, it jams. And so the rice is the flow, or the traffic. So if you have really low traffic, you don't jam. If you do it really fast, then it jams. And the size of your funnel is essentially the gap. So if I have a funnel that's really tiny, I have to pour the rice really, really slowly. Whereas if I have a funnel that's really big, I can pour the rice really fast and be okay. And so in fact, this whole phase space of bridges as jams and no bridges as not jamming is actually a really similar behavior. And I find this really interesting that at one level, of course, we know that the ants are organisms. They're living and breathing and fully living creatures. And yet there are times that they're behaving pretty much almost seemingly indistinguishable from things that are not living and just exploiting the physics of their bodies. And there's a lot of work where people are studying ants both as, especially in these large collectives, both as materials, but also as living organisms that have evolved ways of exploiting the physics of their own bodies. All right, so coming back to, I want to tell you one more thing about army ants, and I did not at all keep track of time. Okay. I want to tell you one more thing about army ants. And this is work done by my colleague, Helen McCreary, who actually spent a lot of time here in Santa Fe. She was a James McDonald Fellow and worked with the Santa Fe Institute, and now she's a lecturer at Tufts. So Helen was another member of this group that went to Panama, and Helen spent 3 months there conducting experiments on army ants. So Simone and his group had noticed that not only could army ants make these shortcut bridges across V's, they actually sometimes had these like long suspension bridges, and they were not sure how these suspension bridges were coming apart. But they started to do some experiments, and they realized that not only could the ants make these pretty long bridges out of their own bodies, they could even repair them. So even as you perturbed it, they could actually fix the bridge in real time. So based on these early observations, Helen decided to design an experiment to test how robust are these kinds of behaviors. How big a suspension bridge can you make? What kind of perturbations can it do? And so you can see Helen sitting next to the apparatus. So what she had to do was trick the ants. You kind of make a ramp of leaves on both sides, and you trick the army ants to go over this apparatus. And so once the army ants are going over this apparatus, they're fine. They treat it as part of their trail. They don't really care. But then you start making their life hard, which is that you start introducing these gaps. And what Helen did is she just sort of, they're walking over it, but she's just creating a gap that's increasing with time. So I'm going to show you a sped up video of what that looks like. And you just have to sort of imagine that it's that little section that she's looking at there. Okay. So here's a video of this happening. It's sped up. So every 30 seconds, she's increasing the gap by 1 millimeter. So in the beginning, the ants were having a great time. They were walking across this thing, no problems. Now it's like kind of hard to get across. So you see them forming a bridge in real time to get across. And as she increases it, more ants are joining into this bridge. So the bridge is actually lengthening as we create this system. So it keeps getting longer and longer and longer, and she does this until it's about 3 centimeters. But then she tricks them. She starts to shorten the gap. So now it's coming closer, and you can see sometimes it breaks. But interestingly, as she shortens it, some of the ants are leaving. So now they're actually decreasing the size of of this. And so we're doing this like every half minute. So they're actually quite quick at doing this. And yes, the last ant does leave. But it's actually a little scary. She kept squishing it and like didn't really want to kill it, but we were trying to stick with the protocol. But they are very squishable, so it did finally leave. All right, so you can see Helen there. These are really difficult experiments to do because unlike experiments that we can do in the lab, here, first you have to trek 10 miles a day, and the army ants are nomadic, which means we actually spend a good part of the day finding them. It's like, where the heck are you setting up camp? So you go, you find them, and then you have to carry everything with you, all your cameras, the umbrella to like deal with the amazing lighting, and all of the apparatus and everything. So you're carrying this enormous backpack while sweating like crazy and trying to find the army ants. And when you do, then you have maybe a couple of hours to quickly set this up, do all of the experiments. All right, so I showed you one example. I'll show you another video from this because this one became viral at some point because it was really quite funny. So here you can see there's so much traffic that the ants just like fell over. And so there's this huge pile. It's almost like spilling milk. But then they form a bridge, and you'll see the remarkable thing is that all of the spilled ants down there actually climb back up. And so that whole part actually dissolves. And this was barely 5 minutes where you couldn't even tell that anything had happened anymore. We have another video from like an iPhone where all of us are screaming. Like, oh my God, are they dissolving? What's happening? But it's really remarkable. These ants are both assembling and disassembling and repairing bridges all in real time at the same time. So the question is, could this behavior also be explained by the same hypothesis? So, or by the same ant behavior? So one way to think about it is, let's imagine that as we stretch the bridges, the bridge gets harder to walk on because now everyone's stretched and so you have nobody to stand on. And maybe that causes congestion, which causes individuals to join the bridge. So as we stretch, we basically worsen the bridge. By worsening the bridge, we create congestion. By creating congestion, we cause ants to join the bridge, thereby making the bridge better and lengthening it. And then the opposite is when we decrease the gap, the bridge becomes slack, and so now there are ants at the bottom that are no longer being walked on, and so they get up and leave. And so in this way, there are both ants being added and ants being moved. And so in this way, you have a bridge that essentially is maintaining its tension. So if I stretch it, it adds more material to become less tense. If I slack it, it takes away more material to come back to the same tension. And there is another system that actually does this, and that's cells during wound repair. So in wound repair, your epithelial cells or your skin cells or your lining cells, they form these tissue sheets. And it's been shown that if you stretch those sheets, the cells actually interpret that as a reason to divide. And so they divide if you stretch. And so that's one way to achieve wound repair. But if you slack them, then they actually kill off some of the cells. And so the tissue can actually maintain a correct density at all times by constantly growing cells or killing cells. And in this case, instead, we're maintaining a constant density. So it turned out that this system also has a kind of close to constant density by either adding ants or removing ants. So we're not killing anybody in this case, but we are, or reproducing in real time, but we are adding and removing material to do this. So this was really cool, and we thought it was really interesting. And then Helen observed something else that was really surprising to us, and that's hysteresis. So hysteresis is this idea that systems have memory after things happen to them. The best way that the way that I usually understand hysteresis is thinking about a rubber band. If you have a perfect rubber band, you stretch it and you release it. And it always is the same. So you stretch it and then you bring it back and it's the same. But a lot of rubber bands don't do that. You stretch it and you bring it back and it's slack. So somehow in the process of stretching it, you deformed it in some way that stayed permanent, so that the next time you came to the original conditions, it doesn't look the same. It has a memory of things that happened in the past. And we think of that as hysteresis. So what Helen observed is that this system actually exhibited hysteresis. So you could think of the red line as the part where we're sort of stretching the rubber band. And so on the horizontal axis is the number of ants, or like the volume of the bridge, but you can just think of number of ants in the bridge. And on the x-axis, or the, wait, that was the vertical axis, sorry. I can do this, vertical axis. And then the horizontal axis is the gap, how much we stretched it. So as she's stretching it, there's a certain number of ants in it. But then when she contracts it back, the number of ants are different in it. So it's actually like much more slack. There are too many ants in it. So it really is like the rubber band that you stretched, and then when you came back, it didn't quite go back to its shape. If this was a perfect rubber band, then the blue and the red lines would be right on top of each other. And so what Helen found is no matter how many different colonies and experiments she did, she always had the same result. And this was not something we were looking for. So why would you want hysteresis? It sounds like a bad idea, right? It's like we always think of this as bad when we have rubber bands. But actually, hysteresis is a really important principle for engineering, and we use it very deliberately. So one example where we use it is in a thermostat. So imagine that you set your thermostat to 72 degrees. I guess I'm picking the number I like, so I like 72 degrees. So I set my thermostat to 72 degrees. And if it's above 72 degrees, then it needs to turn on the air conditioning, and if it's below 72 degrees, it needs to turn on the heater. So now imagine that the temperature is 71.8. So it's like, turn on the heater. And then next moment, it's like 72.5, and it's like, turn on the air conditioning. And then it's just oscillating. It's going crazy right around 72, because being a little bit below or a little bit above, you're just constantly reacting to perturbations. So these are oscillations that happen in real engineering systems if we don't design them correctly. So one way to dampen oscillations is to add hysteresis. And the idea behind hysteresis is that if a perturbation happens, I don't react right away. I'm actually just going to wait a while and let some more perturbations accumulate before I react. So if I'm at 71.8, I don't react. But then it went down to 71.6, and now I'm like, it's not looking good. And then it's 71.4, and I'm like, okay, that was too much. Turn on the heater. So people add hysteresis into thermostats so that we don't have these oscillations. It's a mechanism for dampening oscillations. So our hypothesis is that these systems also have evolved to have hysteresis because these bridges are constantly under perturbation. There might be wind, the things that they build on are often sticks or branches, they might move, and you don't want this system to constantly be adding or removing ants all the time. Instead, it should wait as perturbations accumulate. And so Helen made a model it's called an accumulator model, where you have perturbations that accumulate, and then when enough accumulates, the system reacts. And this was something we also observed in the system ourselves, so you can kind of see it in the dots. The dots don't follow the line exactly. There's dots, and then all of a sudden there's a rise, and there's some dots, and then there's a rise, and there are dots. We actually saw that the system remodeled all of a sudden, and that a lot of times you could stretch, and the ants would just allow themselves to be stretched more and more, and then all of a sudden they would all react and something would happen. And so this is part of the basis for hysteresis systems. So it was really exciting to discover that even another material property, like hysteresis, could be exhibited by these self-assembling ants. And it does mean that we still actually then don't fully understand the local hypothesis by which these ants work. So each time we do these experiments, we're still discovering new and different kinds of rules. Okay, so I've shown you two different systems that were inspired by ants. I briefly talked about the nerd herd as being inspired by ants, and I've shown you one from our lab where robots are inspired by ants. So what kinds of future applications are there where we could use an ant-inspired robot swarm or a robot colony? How about space? Ant colonies in space. So actually, we could imagine not sending one robot or two robots, which is so fragile a decision to make, but instead sending groups of robots into space to do tasks for us. So some of you may have heard talks by Professor Melanie Moses here at University of New Mexico. And her work has looked at, she created something called the Swarmathon, the NASA Swarmathon, where they considered groups of robots that, kind of like the nerd herd, are finding elements in their environment and bringing it together. And this competition involved many different minority-serving institutions designing different kinds of algorithms and designing hardware to see how we could eventually have robots on Mars or on the moon doing exploration and bringing materials back to a home base. And I think this is one exciting way in which an ant colony is a really great model, because there's no leaders in charge, and there might be risks where individual robots might get stuck or waylaid, and we'd like the system to be really robust the way ant colonies are. So that's one application. In my group, we've been starting to look at another application, thinking about robots that are moving on a structure doing inspection. And this is work that we're doing with Dr. Ariel Ekbla, who's at MIT. She's the director of the Space Exploration Initiative. She's a very accomplished space person herself. And the idea is, what if we could have future space stations or spacecraft and have robots moving on the structure constantly monitoring it? So looking for problems, detecting problems, maybe even repairing the problems, maybe even applying materials onto the outside. And so now, instead of climbing robots that climb over each other, which might be still a little bit hard for us to do, we have robots that are climbing over a structure. I like to think of this as arboreal ants that live in trees, and they're constantly moving over this complex 3D structure in a symbiosis with the trees. So we could think of these robots as being in a symbiosis with the spacecraft itself. So with Ariel, we got to do this great experiment. We got to test some robots in weightlessness, and so I'm going to show you a couple of videos from that just to see what that looks like. So I'm going to start with a little piece by Ariel.
This is a space robots project to analyze the motion of robots on the outside of spacecraft for future servicing and maintenance operations.
So here you can see the robot. It's actually a really small robot. This is one of the robots that we're testing. And it has magnets in its wheels so it can move over metal structures. Eventually, we'd have to build more interesting ways of moving. But in this case, we're testing how weightlessness affects the ability to climb. So before I was saying I'm climbing in different orientations or working against gravity. But it turns out if you take that gravity altogether, it also can become hard to climb. So in this case, we're testing these different
one of those
and
then the other one.
We're testing the robots in different orientations. And this was only one of the robots that we tested. So here you can see this test and some problems. We also looked at some robots that were inspired by Melinda's work, so thinking about inchworm-like behavior and soft robots. And our goal was thinking about collaboration. So wheeled robots can move really fast, but maybe our climbing robots could cover gaps. And so maybe the robots could collaborate, where one robot becomes a bridge and the other robot climbs over it. And so we have now robots that act as bridges and other robots that act as moving around. And so it's really fun to see this collaboration, and it was actually really interesting to be able to design these kinds of experiments. So I'll show you just one more video, because I think it's really fun as to how we actually get weightlessness. So obviously none of us really went to space. We haven't trained for anything like that. Instead, we went on an airplane. And this is a company called Zero G, which originally was formed to train astronauts. And the way it works is this airplane shoots straight up into the sky, almost. And when it goes up, you feel really a lot. It's like a roller coaster. When you go up, you feel really heavy. And when you come down really fast, you feel weightlessness. So here we are in the weightless phase. As you can see, if you don't hold on to something, that's Julia from my lab. You might actually just fly off. And then when you go down, it becomes really, really heavy, so we have to lie down. And it's really incredible how much weightlessness you can get. You get only 30 seconds of it at a time, but you can pretty much do anything. So this is Dr. Bahar Hagigat from my lab. She's now a faculty member at University of Groningen in Netherlands, and you'll see her again in a minute. There you see Ariel again giving us the thumbs up. All right. So of course we could think of inspection in space, but we're also really interested in whether we can use this on Earth. So imagine having multiple different kinds of robots moving on a structure and inspecting it. So this is a metal structure, a sculpture outside of our engineering labs. And this is, as I mentioned, Dr. Bahar Hagigat, who's a faculty now. And one of my former undergrad students, Darren. And we're experimenting with swarms of these robots to think about how they would move on this structure, how do they not get lost and remember where they are, and how can they use each other as a way to become more powerful than each robot is on its own. And so here you can see we're just trying to see, and it can go underneath.
I wonder if you can climb that.
We've now built a bunch more of these robots. They were originally designed at MIT. And Bahar is really scared because we had borrowed these robots. So if they broke, we would have been in trouble. But here you can see they're actually pretty funny. They can escape our confines too. So we have a lot of escaping robots, not escaping ants, but escaping robots. All right. So what can thousands of individuals do together as a collective? So I hope I've shown you lots of examples of how remarkable natural collectives are, because I think that in the beginning, I had no idea that ants could do the kinds of things they do. I always thought that was the realm of science fiction movies, like Big Hero 6 or something. But actually, science is crazier than science fiction sometimes. And I've also shown you a bunch of robot examples where we hope that we can make collectives that way. But I think the most amazing collective in all of this always is the human collective. So of course I get to give this talk, but really all of the work that I've shown is a result of science, which is human collective intelligence. Not just the groups that I worked with, but of course all of the scientists who came before us, setting up the situations and the ideas from which we get to build further on and hopefully create more scientists of our own. So this is my nerd herd. I've gotten to work with some really great people from a lot of different disciplines: biologists, engineers, mathematicians, physicists, and I feel like it's really through this interdisciplinary interaction, something that is so terrific about the Santa Fe Institute, this really interdisciplinary interaction that we all get to literally become more than the sum of our parts. So these are some of the terrific people that I've worked with, and as you can see, this is at the top left is the original group that went off to spend all this time in Panama. So that's all I have, and thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, and now we'll open it up for questions.
So we started out in the engineering robotics building. Let's go across the campus to the social science building. Is anybody looking at those ants in terms of the demographics and their role in those gaps, the age, the size, the gender, et cetera?
First of all of the ants are female. So gender is a clear one. So all future societies are female. Yeah, so they're all she. I try to use it so that I think gender is something I hope to get. That's a longer conversation. Okay, coming back to this. Army ants are really interesting in that they have different morphologies. So you have these large ants that are basically, and some of them you might have seen, they had really big kind of tusks, but they basically are teeth, and they will bite you. So they are the soldiers, they're the protectors. Then you have the middle workers who are often the majority of the bridge. And then you have even sort of minor workers, and people still don't quite understand what their role is. They're even smaller. So you have, first of all, this real physical difference between them. And so it is known that, at least in the army ants, they do play different roles. But the roles are swappable. So we have seen soldier ants become bridges. We've often seen minor ants also become part of a bridge. So they're not the majority. They're usually just going to go past or stand around, but there is some there is some flexibility in the roles that they have. And people have done very specific things to look at that flexibility. One of the other thing you asked me was about age. And I think army ants are really hard to study because they're nomadic. So I would say like all of the information on army ants is kind of poor compared to some other systems. But in bees, a lot is known about age. And there definitely are different roles that are played at different ages. So for example, the young bees, there is some amount of learning where the bees learn how to navigate and find their way back to the nest. And so the young bees are often doing tasks inside the nest, whereas the older bees are the ones that are going outside, finding food sources and coming back. So you're essentially sending your more reliable, people who are not going to get lost, to come back. And people have studied a little bit of like that transition, like at what point does a young bee get to go out and be an experienced individual. And so there's a lot of literature on trying to understand how that transition happens with age. So I feel like one of the interesting things that I've learned from working with biologists is that each system they study provides a different opportunity to understand something about social behavior, even about our own evolution of social behavior. Because sometimes these things are just reflecting back to us things that we know we do. Like fish move in herds, people move in herds. We also move like fish and bison. We display some of the exact same behaviors. So there is a connection there. But each organism, we're only able to ask certain questions. So frustratingly, we don't have any example of collective where you know everything. Instead, you know something in here and something in here and something in here. So it is kind of hard. I wish we did know more about army ants, but I am now convinced it's really hard. So I can see why we may never know those answers.
My second question is, how often do you get bit? But the first question is, you showed a video of a simulation, the simulated robots forming the cantilever bridge. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you programmed them to preferentially form a horizontal bridge, but have you thought of the problem of deciding whether to go horizontal or vertically down or vertically up the way the ants can?
So in that one, it was really interesting. The way we had envisioned that one and the way Melinda ended up doing it is that there is a goal. So somewhere in the environment, I've placed a goal, and the ants or the robots can detect that there's a goal. And this is kind of how we were thinking that weaver ants do it, is that they're often creating bridges across branches or different parts of leaves, and then they actually ratchet together. So they even use those things as pulling chains. It's really quite remarkable. But often it's clear that they're trying to get to something. So if that thing is up, then it looks like a tower. If that thing is across, then it looks like a bridge. If the thing is down, it looks like a chain. And so in the way she programmed it, you just move the goal around. There isn't a sense in which they're trying to make different structures. They're just trying to reach. And it's like, well, I reached as far as I could, and then someone stepped on me, so I just stuck there. And then it reached as far as it could, but then someone stepped on it. But eventually, you're still reaching, and you just have no way to get there, so you kind of are stuck anyways. And so that's the kind of behavior we were exploiting there. Does that answer the question you meant? And then your second question was how many times we get bit. So I think all of us got bit at least once. Helen probably got bit a lot of times. But it is kind of painful. They lock their jaws into your finger, but they actually have no mechanism for unlocking. So it's kind of a one-time deal. So you're stuck with this thing that's pierced into you, and no amount of convincing it. So you basically have to like break its body off and then sit there and pry it with pliers, with the little tweezers, I mean. It does kind of suck. But this species is actually really nice, and they don't, at best they bite you. There's another species that also like puts a little venom into it, so it like really stings and hurts. In addition to being bit, you also have like a burning sensation for the next day. So luckily we were not working with that species. Made it a lot easier. But thank you for the question.
A lot of the experiments you've performed have been on like creatures of lower level intelligence. How do the patterns you've observed apply to a pod of dolphins or like a group of humans?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think I'm always afraid to call ants having lower intelligence because the more they do, the more crazy they seem to me. So I'm like not even sure anymore. Like maybe this is all a simulation. They're simulating us, and I had no idea what's going on. The ants are pretty amazing. But I think that when you go to like bison, right? So like now you have a big, or even just large human groups, maybe we do behave the same way as ants. But then when you go to dolphins, and you're talking about smaller numbers of individuals, there might just be I think that there are very different techniques by which a group will behave. And so one sort of idea might be that maybe group size, in addition to intelligence and language and all of the other things that, for example, we assume that organisms similar to us have, we use language quite a bit, right? So maybe size also matters. So if I'm in a small group, I can do things like dolphins. Like we could take roles, we could even decide who's going to be on which side, we have gestures. But once I'm in a big group, I can't actually do that anymore. I can't rely on that. I might just say like, everybody out of the exit, and then hope everything goes well. You know, because it's no longer, language is no longer sufficient as a mechanism for coordination. So I have to admit, like I'm still trying to understand that exact question that you asked. Like, where are those fundamental, when we see these different ways and different strategies of working together, is it coming from the fact that certain organisms have symbolic language and that makes a difference? Or is it coming from the fact that it's a small group and small groups behave differently? But I think that's really still an open question. So a lot of people debate it and make abstract models. It's a great area for study to think about the different group strategies. Is there a way to think about, yeah, how different groups work? That's a great question. Thank you.
Has anyone conferred with or consulted with E.O. Wilson on this? The second question is, why did this species evolve this way, and have other ant species also constructed structure like harvester ants don't, for example? Thank you.
So actually, of course, E.O. Wilson studied many of these different species. Maybe not so much the army ants, but another example of a highly evolved or complex system are the leafcutter ants. And so there's a great deal, there's a beautiful book on that with lots of gorgeous pictures by E.O. Wilson. And so it seems that there are certain ants species, and I don't want to misspeak here, but I think they call them eusocial, ones that have evolved like really complicated social constructions. So leafcutter ants, for example, will go up into trees and they cut leaves and they bring it back, but they have such a complex society. They have actually created an assembly line. So there are individuals who are cutting the leaves, there are individuals who are bringing the leaves, there are different individuals who are clearing the path. They even have ones that are cutters. They come and they cut the grass. So they make sure that the path is nice and clean for the other individuals to bring as much material back together. And these colonies have millions of individuals, and they can have these vast underground nests that people have excavated that literally look like cities. You have like all of these chambers connected by these tunnels. And so that's another case where I'm like a little confused as to whether or not ants have like a whole different society going down there that I don't know about. But it is an open question, like why did these certain species evolve so much complexity? And so army ants are an example, weaver ants are another example. Weaver ants live in trees, and they actually make their nests by folding leaves over. So they make chains across different parts of the leaf, and then they actually kind of ratchet together, so they basically are using the chains to pull the parts of the leaves together. And then they use silk from their larvae to basically stitch it, or basically glue it together. That seems crazy. I was like, that can't be true. This is a movie. Somebody made this up. But somehow they've evolved, and they live robustly in trees this way all the time. So there are like these really incredible examples that people study. But why they evolved to do this is still, like, I think, a mystery, as far as I know. But you probably ask some of the senior people like E.O. Wilson or Naomi Pierce these kinds of questions. I think it's still a mystery as to how evolution went through a path where there's so so incredibly complex ant societies? At least I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I have a question here, maybe a little bit provocative, but inanimate matter also exhibits the same pattern. You showed that, the funnel, and then you look at phase transitions. So some of the behaviors that large, and I wouldn't call them intelligent or unintelligent, but I think ants are a lot similar to each other than humans are. So there's differentiation in intellect, and that creates complications. So maybe the question I have is, do you see the same patterns that the patterns you're seeing reflect, as you showed, some of the physical laws of, so you can have molecules attracting and repulsing at a certain distance, and based on that, they exhibit patterns. Here, you're translating them into code, right? And this is no longer ants just following.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it is similar. It's inter-ant interaction.
Yeah.
And same behaviors follow.
I think it is a really interesting question whether, if as the number goes up, you're kind of going further and further into statistical mechanics, right? So I think that debate is really very alive. So people think of fish as self-propelled particles, right? So it's a particle, but it also has an energy source, which is slightly different. So I've gotten rid of conservation of energy. So now maybe there are other things that I can exhibit that wouldn't be true for materials that are not actually eating energy and using energy to produce actuation. So this concept that maybe there are active materials and active materials can do more. And so ants are now an active material. But I would say that humans can also act as active materials. So for example, people study the response of humans during panic. And even when there are large openings that we should be able to get through, we actually jam and manage to do things that cause more death than would have happened if we just moved slowly and got through this thing. We're almost like the rice that is just rushing through this funnel. And so people who are studying often human group behavior, especially in situations of panic where we're not going to use this heavy intellect in order to assess where just like predator has arrived, move, we perhaps behave more in these fundamental modes that are available to us from however we evolved, from whatever organisms we evolved, that this just goes deeper as a resource that we have for working together. And sometimes that can lead to really good things, like human groups navigating together and moving across in caravans these long distances. So much of that has to do with giving up your own personal intellect and desires and going with the group, believing in the navigation of whoever in the group was deciding which way to go. And so in that moment, we maybe are going back to behaving like fish schools and actually benefiting from that. So I think both pathological states and beneficial states that we experience as humans could come from those things as well. And I would say that ants have personalities. Like, people have looked at the fact that different colonies have what they would call culture. Some colonies are actually much more aggressive at moving around and creating trails, and some are much more subdued. And you can kind of see this even passed on to their progeny. So Deborah Gordon's group at Stanford has really studied this, where they looked at these different colonies of harvester ants. I hope I'm picking the right ant. I think it is the harvester ants. And some colonies were like creating lots of trails and gathering lots of food, and other colonies had smaller trails and had smaller colonies. And she did this 20-year experiment, which is kind of crazy, but every year they would go out and they would catalog all of the colonies and look at the genetic relationship, so which were the new colonies. And it turned out that the one that wins in 20 years is not the one who was aggressively eating food. And so that was like a major surprise, that in fact, like, the short-term activity, which many people were interpreting as success, and the long-term success, as in how many colonies are from your genetic material, were not necessarily correlated. So I think we still don't have so many different ways in which we don't understand the relationship between individuals and then culture, and then multiple cultures, and then the impact that has on evolutionary success. So it means that we scientists can never be out of a job, so I'm good with that.
As I was watching the videos, I didn't notice any ants falling. and I'm curious if the Army ants have a no ant left behind policy. But in all seriousness, I was curious if there are different species of swarms that have, where individuals sacrifice themselves for the greater good.
Yeah, so army ants are really good climbing. So it's actually kind of hard. They just don't fall off of anything unless you kick them off or you coat it with like really serious. It's very hard to contain them in any which way. They just get out of everything. So we don't actually know. So one of the things that would happen during this experiment is that you could sometimes mess up. And so you did something drastic and the ants didn't like it. So they take a U-turn and they just like leave your apparatus. And you're there trying to coax them back with like a water bottle. We squirt them. So it's just like you squirt a dog to tell it that it's doing the wrong thing. We're squirting the ants, but they still leave. But when they leave, now there's no trail. So you can see these ants like wandering, trying to figure out how to get back home. And my presumption is that a bunch of them get lost, but there's just millions of them. So they're migrating, they're moving in different places. And so I would say like there's definitely ants left behind. There's definitely a not no child left behind policy. But the soldiers can and do sacrifice themselves. So as I was explaining, when they bite, that's kind of the end. They can't actually unclasp their jaws. So that's sort of a fatal choice to bite, as opposed to just posture and like scare everyone off. So when they raid or they get raided, they do end up sacrificing soldiers. And so that is an example where, some of them are essentially, maybe less likely to live as long as the other ants. Again, I don't think we know enough about army ants, but there are probably other species where they know more about whether you see very active forms of sacrificing. And I guess the way I would think about it is that ants are clonally related. So unlike a fish school where each fish actually has a different genetic code, ants are practically like cells. So people think of an ant colony often as being a collection of cells. And we know that cells in our body will die. You have sort of apoptosis where cells actively die in order to create some structure or in order to fix some infection. And that's fine because all of the other cells are there. The organism is fine. Even if some of your cells die, that's perfectly fine. So an ant colony in some ways is closer to an organism with cells. So it would be not that surprising to have ants sacrifice themselves because actually they're just genetically identical to a lot of the others. And so that's an okay strategy, evolutionarily speaking. I hope that my biologist colleagues agree with what I'm saying. I realize all of this, I'm sort of channeling the things that I've learned from them, but there could be errors in my understanding. So I hope you'll take this all with a grain of salt.
We've got one more question back here.
Oh, I have one more. All right.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was curious about if you witnessed any reward incentives in the ants' behavior, and if within the robotics section of this, you would want to incentivize teamwork. So if one robot could complete a task by itself, it would be programmed to wait until it would work with a cooperator.
That's a really interesting question. And I think that maybe because in this system we were so focused on ants that sort of cooperate by design, we weren't thinking of incentives per se. But even for the ants, there are incentives. So for example, although I showed it as very simply as this trail and individuals forming bridges, there's actually ants going in both directions. In one direction, there are ants that are going towards the food source, and in the other directions, there are ants coming back that are carrying the food source. And one of the things we found is that those carrying the food source never cooperate in the bridge. They actually only cross the bridge. So they are way too valuable. They're holding like the food of the colony, and they're trying to get it as fast as possible to the nest. So they're just waiting for other people to do the teamwork of making the bridge. So you could argue that even in that system where there isn't explicitly an incentive, there is kind of an incentive. If you have food, then you are incentivized to go back to the nest as quickly as possible. And you are not a good team member if you're going to sit in a bridge with the food and keep it there. You need to just be hurrying on. Whereas if you're not carrying food and you're going to get food, well, maybe you should first be willing to sacrifice your time and life to be this bridge so that others with food can get the food fast. And that's the teamwork that is incentivized for you. But I haven't done a system where we looked more at maybe going back to the human model where individuals have really individual goals, and so by nature they're not automatically cooperating, they're automatically doing whatever they need to do, and that only in certain situations there needs to be an incentive to work as a team. And I don't have, I guess it's something I haven't actually worked on, but there are other people in robotics who have worked on that. And one of the ways that they've worked on this is when people from different labs bring robots together. So now you contributed some robots, I contributed some robots, and the robots are all programmed slightly differently. They work on certain principles, but we would still like the robots to work together. And so now there has to be some sort of notion of teamwork that is separate from how the robots themselves have been programmed to ask. And even so, you might even have robots cooperating with humans, and now again, you might need to have some sort of notion of incentives and teamwork explicitly programmed into the robots. So there are several faculty who are working on those kinds of areas as well. It's just not an area that I know that well.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.
All right. Thank you, everyone.